Next. How do I know if or when I enter the donut hole? Okay, so we're talking about the donut hole. We're talking about, technically it's called the coverage gap, phase 3 of the Medicare Part D prescription drug program. The donut hole is, and I'm not going to give the number because, again, I don't know what year you're going to be looking at this video, and it changes a little bit each year. But what happens is when the retail cost of your drugs, not what you pay, the retail cost hits a certain dollar amount, and it's going to be pushing, it's already past $3,000, and it's going to be past $4,000 at some point. The costs you pay change. You switch from paying copays on most drugs to paying a different amount, and what that amount is going to depend based on the drug. Now, I want to define retail costs for you first before I define how you know if or when you enter the donut hole. That cost is calculated by that retail cost, and what a retail cost is the combined cost of you and the insurance company paying for the drug. So if a drug has a retail cost of $100, but your cost before the donut hole was $20, say you've got a $20 copay, you're paying $20, the insurance company is paying $80, but the full $100 is what's counting against you towards entering that donut hole. So it's not what you pay. You could easily pay less than around $500 or even less than that and still enter the donut hole. There was one year I actually had an insurance company that paid 100% of copays before the donut hole for all generic drugs. And I had a couple of clients that had some very expensive generic drugs, and I'm talking generic drugs that were well over $200 at least. I don't think they pushed $300, but they were over $200 a month. So that person was really happy. He was paying nothing for his drugs that year until he entered the donut hole and gave a call and wondered what happened. Well, what happened was you entered the donut hole. And so, I mean, that can happen. It's not what you pay, it's what that retail cost is, what you and the insurance company are paying together to get you into that donut hole. So that's the first thing you got to be aware of, is that getting a plan with lower copays doesn't protect you from the donut hole at all. The only thing that protects you from the donut hole is going to your doctor and ask if there's something that you can take that'll keep you as healthy, that's going to have a lower cost. And that's a different discussion. That's not a discussion you have with me or with your insurance agent. That's a discussion you have with your doctor. But if you enter the donut hole, sometimes people don't realize when they've entered it, or they think they've entered it, but they actually haven't. And here's the reason these things have happened. So first of all, if you're not sure if you've entered the donut hole, the easiest thing to do is to ask the insurance company. Not me, actually, in this case. This is kind of one of those cases where the insurance company is going to be able to get you quicker, more accurate answers than I will. And that doesn't happen often, but it does happen on prescription drug plans just because of the complex nature of the program. But you may enter it when you noticed you took a jump in your prescription drug costs. So that is sometimes the first thing that does it. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have entered the donut hole. Sometimes you were given you were expecting to pay a 30-day cost, but you got a 90-day list of drugs, and that drug cost was that 30-day cost multiplied by 3, and you get the 90-day cost in some cases. Sometimes you are confusing last year's copays with this year's copays, which I know that sounds like a silly thing, and I apologize if you think that I'm underestimating you, but I bring it up because it's a real thing and it does happen a lot. People were expecting the plan, your drug cost to be one thing, and here we are the next year, and you had a 90-day supply that lasted you longer than 90 days. Here we are in the 5th or 6th month of the year, and you have to have your first fill of the current year. And that particular drug took a hike in premium, in copays. That can happen. You're not in the donut hole, but the cost went up, and you got a 90-day supply of it. Or it changed tiers from a Tier 1 drug to a Tier 2 drug. Translation, it went from a preferred drug to a non-preferred drug. Even as a generic, that can happen. The other thing that could happen is it went to a coinsurance from a copay. What coinsurance means, the difference is a copay is a flat amount. A $20 copay is a flat amount. Coinsurance is 20%. Medicare Part B is 80-20 coinsurance. So if it switched from, say, a $20 copay to a 20% copay, that could make you feel as if you went into the donut hole where you didn't. Even if you did know that you did have coinsurance, you could still think you went into the donut hole because that drug took an increase in the retail cost. That retail cost can go up, and neither I nor you nor the insurance company have any control on that one. If the drug increases its retail cost from $100 per 30 days to $175 per 30 days, and your coinsurance is 20%, you're paying 20% on $175 instead of $100, and that's going to be a little bit of a chunk in your increased costs for some people. So these things can kind of increase your costs on the Medicare prescription drug plan. And that's not even an indicator of whether or not you enter a donut hole. That's just, the cost of things, as unfortunate as it is. The other thing that can happen with that is your drug could be retiered. And I kind of touched upon this, but this is more of a end of the year, beginning of the next year thing. The prescription drug plans have no obligation to keep a preferred generic drug. It could go from a preferred generic to a non-preferred generic. In some cases, this is happening a lot in Ohio, our state right now, with this state for some reason is number 1 in the country at this moment with opioid addiction. So a lot of the prescription opioids are going, even the generic ones are going from preferred generic, or in some cases even non-preferred generic, to non-preferred brand, which is a significant hike in prescription drug costs. This is the difference of going from, say, a $4 copay to a $78 coinsurance. That happened a lot this year, more than I've ever seen it in the past, and that's happening across the board with most plans. So this is something that the prescription drug plans are doing as a response to Ohio's problem, and it is a big issue, and I just use that as an example, but it can be just about any drug. There is not any kind of obligation that if you start off on Medicare Part D having 6 or 7 Tier 1 drugs, 5 years down the line, you could have 1 Tier 1 drug, 4 Tier 2 drugs, and a couple of Tier 3 drugs, and maybe even a Tier 5, and they could actually be the same drugs. So the insurance company does change those tiers each year, and there's no conspiracy about it. Think whatever you want. There's no conspiracy about it. For the most part, when an insurance company is changing the tiers, it's because they can't get the drug for as affordable a price for the coming year that they got the prior year. That's just what they were able to manage that year. There, for the most part, is not a conspiracy on most of the drugs. Excuse me. Now, once you enter the donut hole, here's how you know. Every month that you get prescription drugs, you get a statement of benefits. It's called an explanation of benefits from your prescription drug plan. On the bottom of the first or second page, one of those pages, there is a countdown ticker saying how many dollars left you have to go until you enter that donut hole. You should be able to see from the number of dollars that you spent that month, add it to the previous month, just how many dollars are coming away from that ticker each and every month, where you should be able to get a good estimate of when you enter the donut hole, excluding, if you wind up getting a one-off drug because you got sick and you need an antibiotic, or something happened, you had a surgery, so you're getting a couple of medications, but it's only a temporary thing. I'm talking the maintenance medications only. When you get those maintenance medications, you should have an idea just what those retail costs are, and you should be able to calculate from that when you enter the donut hole. Now, if you're pretty close to entering the donut hole, if they're saying you're going to enter the donut hole around November, December, it may not be a bad idea the next time you see your doctor to ask, if you're comfortable doing this, to ask if there may be a lower cost alternative drug you can get that will keep you as healthy as the drugs you're taking right now, to maybe squeak yourself out of entering the donut hole. So that is kind of one of the biggest things you can do. It isn't the insurance company, as I said before, that's getting you into the donut hole or coverage gap, whatever you want to call it. It's the drugs that you're taking. And if you don't like when you're entering the donut hole, you can go to your doctor and ask if there's an alternative. Now, that doesn't mean demand an alternative, because your doctor should be giving you the best drug that he or she feels will keep you healthy, and you and that doctor is going to have to decide, okay, is this something that's affordable? Can you do it? And if not, what are the alternatives there? But I got to tell you, the donut hole is the donut hole. It's going to be the same in all plans pretty much. There are a few drugs that are a little bit different when you enter that coverage gap, that they'll actually cover at a better price, or at as good a price as before you entered the donut hole. But generally, those drugs are not the ones that put you in the coverage gap in the first place. Usually, those drugs you're going to wind up with whatever you're going to wind up with. So keeping the cost down is going to be a question between you and your doctor of which drugs you can safely take, and are there any alternatives that are going to be safer, are going to be as safe but are going to be cheaper. Now, there are some things that a person has. Generally, we know that if a person is a diabetic, they're going to enter the donut hole. There's just no inexpensive alternatives. Diabetic that takes insulin, excuse me. If a person has chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or many other pulmonary disorders, breathing problems, they're going to enter the donut hole. There's just very few inexpensive alternatives at the time this video is being recorded, unfortunately, for a person to keep those costs down. So you're going to have, unfortunately, a coverage gap problem. But so many other prescriptions, there's many things you can do. You can find out, are you taking a combination drug? Sometimes it's significantly cheaper to remove the combination. I've got one client that's coming to mind right now. She takes a drug that has 3 drugs in one. They're 3 $4 to $5 generics, but together she's getting them as about $100. So that is one really expensive thing that a person can do to reduce those costs, is to break those down. And that's not something you can always do, but that is something that if you do have a coverage gap problem or you just plain don't like your costs for your drugs, you can ask your doctor about that. Do I have any drugs that can be separated to be cheaper? Let's see, what other things to do if you know or when you enter the donut hole. Sometimes the pharmacist can tell you. Pharmacists' machines tell them if you enter the donut hole, but they haven't always been 100%, especially if you're on the cusp of entering the donut hole, because if there is a problem, your drugs are actually going into the donut hole and you're getting say oh, I don't know, 5 days you wind up with donut hole prices, but the other 25 days worth of coverage you're not. The pharmacist's machines, as far as I know, are not able to tell you that. If you enter the donut hole that trip, but you've also got some other drugs that are not in the donut hole, just are really expensive, the pharmacist is going to have trouble breaking that down. So calling the insurance company a lot of times can help you with that breakdown. The insurance company can also give you some names of some alternative drugs that you might be able to take that you need to ask your doctor if you can safely take. And I know this question has kind of evolved into things to do to keep out when you enter the donut hole rather than how do you know when you enter the donut hole. But I think this is important too, I want to mention. The other thing, and the last thing, is if you're taking a bunch of brand drugs and there's generic drugs available, you should ask your doctor if you can take this generic safely. I can think of 2 drugs that I know people commonly cannot take the generic drug. Not everybody, but some people cannot take the generic drugs. They must take the brand drug. But for the most part, if there is a generic drug available, the insurance companies are going to give you a great deal of incentives to switch over to the generic drug. I'm sorry, I'm looking. There's a bee buzzing outside this house, outside my window, and I'm looking. I don't want it entering. But if you take a, lost my train of thought when I heard that bee. If you get that generic drug, or excuse me, if you get that brand drug and there is a generic that's available or becomes available, even if it is affordable to you, they're going to make it so that it's eventually going to be where the insurance company may feasibly stop offering that brand drug. I know when that's happened because I've got a client that insists on taking a brand drug when the generic is available, and there's no history of people required to take that brand drug, and that which is the majority of generic drugs. If there's no history of it, insurance companies are eventually going to drop the brand. And that means that if you want to take a brand drug when the generic is readily available and there's no scientific or medical reason for a person to continue to take the brand, the insurance companies are just going to plain drop it off their list. Now, that does not mean that you will not be able to get that drug. That means that you will not be able to have the insurance company cut the cost of that drug down. Remember, insurance doesn't stop you from getting a drug. Insurance the lack of insurance just may make it unaffordable. But the only thing that can stop you from getting a drug is the doctor saying, no, I will not prescribe this drug. Insurance just kind of cuts these costs down. Other things on the donut hole. When you enter the donut hole, sometimes you may not notice it. Entering the donut hole does not mean anymore that the cost is going to hike up, or at least I should say anymore as of the time of this recording. With the donut hole, it used to be when the law was originally written that you'd pay 100% of the cost of the drugs while you were in it. That changed when the Affordable Care Act kicked in, and now you're paying considerably less in a lot of cases than you were in all cases when you entered the donut hole, even if it doesn't appear that way. But there's now this repeal and replace effort going on with the Affordable Care Act. Whether or not it happens or not, if they're actually talking about repealing all aspects of the Affordable Care Act, they're not really talking about the fact that the Affordable Care Act knocked down the costs in the donut hole, which means that if they actually do a real repeal of the Affordable Care Act, there is a chance that you could be harmed considerably on the costs of a drug once you enter the donut hole. I'm not going to get political one way or the other. I really don't want you to on the comments either. But the Affordable Care Act did knock down the cost of drugs in the donut hole, whether you notice it or not. So there is a chance that could go away depending on when you see this video. I don't know what's going to happen to the drugs at that time. I'm sure I'll put out a video about it once that part of it is settled. But the cost in the donut hole could be you're paying, say, 40% of a brand, and don't hold me to that number because I just pulled it out of my you-know-what. That number is correct for some years, but not all years. So you could have a copay of $20 for a $100 drug. But when you enter the donut hole, you're paying, say, 40%. So of that $100 drug, you're paying $40. So your cost jumped from $20 to $40. That is not as bad as them saying what they used to say, which is once you enter the donut hole, that $20 drug becomes $100. But still, I understand for some people, going from $20 to $40 can be a significant increase. So that is something else. But then again, if that drug cost you, say, $20 if it was retail, when you entered the donut hole, there is actually a chance that that drug would go down to $14. So sometimes it actually works in the other direction too. That's kind of the mathematics of paying a coinsurance rather than a copay, which is what the donut hole is. You switch to coinsurance. You pay a percentage of the retail costs when you enter it. For the most part, it goes up. For some people, it goes down. So basically what I'm saying is take a look at your insurance explanation to benefits and look for that countdown ticker. It's going to tell you how far you have to go until you enter that donut hole. And when in doubt, ask us. Give a call to the insurance company. Ask them. Ask your agent if they can help figure it out. And yeah, just be aware of your costs. The whole purpose of the donut hole is to make you cost aware so that you know what costs to look for, what the costs are of your prescription drugs, and so that when you are getting prescriptions from your doctor, you can ask the question, hey doctor, is there something I can take that will do just as well, give me the health that I want to have and you want me to have, but will not cost as much, so that I'm not paying as much for that drug when I go to the pharmacy. That is a conversation that only you can have with your doctor. For the most part, doctors are cost aware these days as a result of everything that's going on, especially with the donut hole and with prescription drug prices being in the news. But it doesn't hurt to always keep in mind you have to take ownership yourself of your prescription drugs and say, okay, these costs are high. If I gotta pay them to keep healthy, I will. But is there something we can try first that you think will achieve the same result, but will not cost me as much? And that basically the whole purpose of the donut hole is to put those costs back in your corner so that you can take ownership of it and ask your doctor just to make sure that you're not overpaying unnecessarily when something less expensive will do. It's better for you, it's better for the insurance company, and it's better for prescription drug costs all around. The one thing that'll get costs down is if people stop getting expensive prescription drug costs, getting expensive prescription drugs in higher numbers, when lower cost prescription drugs are significantly more readily bought. Eventually, the people who set prescription drug prices will bring those costs down when they realize it. It doesn't happen quickly, but it does happen, and this is one of the things that you can do. Your contribution is to make sure if there's a drug you can take that'll get you healthy, that's cheaper, you're asking for it.